over recent years, there's been a bit of a resurgence in coil shocks, either being stocked to bikes or retrofitted. Now, is it riders searching for speed, that silky smooth ride, or maybe something else, Neil?
I don't know, Rich. Let's dive into it. Let's do this coil versus air shock debate. Try and help the viewers pick the right one for them. Find out what's the most fun, but also what is the fastest.
To do this then, let's take a look at a few pros and cons of each type of shock. So for that, over to you, Professor Neil.
Hello, Richard. Yes, air shocks are pretty much standard on most bikes these days, other than the odd downhill and maybe enduro bike that still run coils. So air shocks are light. They use air inside chambers, basically one as a spring and one as a negative to return the shock. And they are super progressive as well, which means that they get harder to compress the further they go into the travel, and they're super tunable as well. Obviously, with an air pump, you've got almost infinite adjustability depending on how much pressure you put in there. Shocks will tell you how much, maximum, 325 max on this. So for some of the bigger riders, maybe they don't suit exactly. But whereas with a coil shock, you have to wind the spring or change the spring, these are almost infinitely tunable. As well as that, you can adjust the air volume inside these with volume spacers to tune just how linear or progressive you make these things. That makes these shocks super popular with manufacturers and with shops, because they can stock that same shock on any bike depending on if it's small or large. Doesn't matter on the weight of the rider. If they had coil shocks, then they'd have to have lots of different springs so they could change it for the rider. Also, some downhill riders do like these because of how tunable they are. They can get that sort of suspension curve exactly how they want it. The coil shock, as named because of the coil spring in it, which is normally made out of steel or much more expensive and much lighter titanium, is, like we say, chosen by some downhill bikes, and actually they're getting more popular in enduro again, mainly because of their biggest advantage, which is small bump sensitivity. Basically because they've got less seals in them than air shocks. You know, those shocks have to keep high pressure air inside. These don't. They use this spring for the spring of the shock, obviously, which makes them heavier. Not such a big advantage on a downhill bike, and like I say, because they have less seals, they feel really a lot more supple on the smaller bumps. They are more resistant to heating up on long downhills, which is another reason why downhill riders love these. Air shocks can get really hot and start to feel a little bit inconsistent. A coil shock is more linear than an air shock, so where an air is more progressive the further into travel, a coil shock will still take the same amount of pressure to compress it all the way through, which does suit some bikes. The small bump sensitivity and the linear feel of these can feel great on some bikes, but on others it might feel like you're too far into the travel and actually you bottom out quite easily. They can't be used on all bikes, basically because that piggyback might not fit the frame layout, but also the suspension kinematics of the bike might be too linear as well. So added with this together, you'll just sit too far into the travel. Weight could be around 0.5 kilogram heavier for a coil shock. In theory, if you ride long descents and you want your suspension to work really well and you're not so worried about an efficient pedaling bike, then in theory, a coil shock should be better for you. If you want a lighter, more easily tunable shock that once you're past that initial stiction, feels just as good and gives you a poppier ride rather than just hugging the floor, then an air shock should be for you. But let's see how that works out in reality. Back to you, Rich.
That's the different types of units then. Thank you very much, Professor Neil. And you might be thinking, well, what kind of shock is best for me? What should I be putting on my bike if I'm thinking of switching up? Well, coil shocks are traditionally found on anything, like you said, from trail bikes through to downhill bikes. You don't ever really see them on XC bikes, generally because they're small amounts of travel, 100, 120 mil maybe at most today. But XC bikes are all about weight, keeping it as light as possible. So coil shocks just don't really fit the bill there. On top of that, you've got shorter eye-to-eye lengths, shorter stroke lengths. So putting a big coil shock, being able to fit an actual coil in that space ain't really going to happen. Which is why today I thought we'd do this test on this, my nuke-proof Mega. So this is 160, 170 mil travel, full suspension enduro bike, and it's an absolute race weapon. In fact, this bike actually comes spec'd with both coil and air shocks. I've got the standard air shock on it at the moment, the Rock Shock Deluxe. And then we're going to put a coil shock on it later on. And you can actually choose to get this bike with the coil that I'm going to put on. I've chosen this bike because it is actually the kind of bike that you might find either type of shock on. And with this being a proper enduro race bike as well, enduro stages, well, if you're looking at a world sort of stage, if you like, they can be up to 20 minutes plus long, rough as anything, pedaling. So really the proper do it all kind of bike, and therefore you need a shock that can do it all as well.
Right, to put this to the test, we're going to need a long, rough, physically demanding descent. I've got just the one for you, Rich. We're here at Bike Park Wales in the beautiful liquid sunshine, and we're going to ride, or you're going to ride, Blackadder into Rimdinger, good name for it.
Oh.
That's 2 kilometres of rough, rocky, rooty, braking bumps. I think that should do it.
Yikes. All right, Neil, thank you very much for that. And to keep things even, Stevens, the shocks are my own. They're set up for me, so my riding style, my weight, all the compression settings, the rebounds is all done already. And we'll be doing multiple runs, of course, and I'll even check tyre pressures in between to make sure it remains consistent.
Good luck, Rich. I expect to see some fast times.
Here we find ourselves at the top then, and a slight change of plan. Turns out Blackadder is actually closed, so we're going to hit Die Hard, another great black run running from the top here. The length and the type of track doesn't really change, so let's go hit that instead. Skittish, and across the line. Okay, and with that, back to the top for the coil shock. Whew, okay, it is time to get that coil unwound. The weather has finally stopped raining, so that's why I've ditched the coat. Track is exactly the same, multiple runs incoming in 3, 2, 1, see ya! Right, that is all the runs done on both bikes. I've got a feeling which I think is faster. If you do too, let me know in the comments down below, but otherwise it's back to HQ and let's check out those times. So today was all about what was going to be fastest, coil versus air. And I can tell you, on average, after 3 runs on each, the results were the coil shock did it in 4 minutes 7 average down our just over sort of 4 minute long 2K track. The air shock, 4 minutes 5 seconds, so on average it's 2 seconds quicker for the air shock. Now let's dive into that quickly, because there are a few bits where it was won and lost. So the air shock, where it was a bit flatter at the top half of the trail and some less chattery, some bigger jumps and just a bit more speed, it was quicker. That's where it made its time. It was about 4 seconds quicker. But the coil shock, where it got much rougher at the end and sort of really bigger bumps, much choppier, that's where it pulled back that couple of seconds. The air shock, the coil shock, sorry, was actually quicker at the ending there. However, I think sort of that slight bobbing, that weight disadvantage at the top is really what cost it. So the air shock is the winner then, only just pipping it. So why would you choose an air shock? Well, I think each different type of shock suits different type of riders. Now, when I'm on an enduro bike, and I'm going to talk about enduro bikes specifically here, but it can kind of transfer over into other genres. When I'm hammering my enduro bike, I like to give it the full gas, and the way that I like the back end to feel, a coil shock suits that. So the big hits, the tracking, that sort of nice linear feel, and it doesn't change over the course, especially when we're at big mountains doing long runs. So a coil shock, I think, suits me really well. However, a downside to a coil shock, if you want to change how it feels, you need to change the spring. You can't just change an air pressure nice and easy like you can in an air shock. That means you've got to buy a new spring. Now, a cheap spring is going to cost you about 45 or so quid. An expensive spring, that's going to set you back around 150 quid. So there is that to bear in mind. You can't just buy a shock, boom, done. Especially if you get one off the shelf, if it comes on your bike and doesn't feel right, you then got to buy a spring. So that is where I do like the air shocks, especially on shorter travel bikes and sometimes course depending. That air shock's tunability, so that ability to change the air volume, the amount of tokens, high and low speed compression now, and then obviously easily lock it out, plus it's lightweight, does mean that if I'm doing an enduro race where it's maybe flatter, a lot more pedaling, I would actually switch to that. So that is all worth bearing in mind. But anyway, surprise perhaps, maybe not for some others. Let me know what you thought in the comments down below. If you want to see any more verses of any more different bike parts, maybe we could do forks, carbon versus aluminium wheels perhaps, happy to smash them down, ring dinger again down there, because that was good fun. But let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, everyone. Don't forget, cheeky like and subscribe does go a long way as well, and I'll see you next time.